men. 22 days. 1 locked cupboard. Those are the 3 numbers this whole story runs on, and I want them in your head before anything else happens, because at the point where the ice came down, every single person at Bellcross Furnace except one believed that cupboard was a crime. The Bellcross Furnace stood in a hollow in the Missouri Ozarks, and in the January of 1888, it employed 71 men to make cold blast charcoal iron, which is a trade that has almost entirely stopped existing, and which I should explain, because the whole shape of the disaster depends on it. A charcoal furnace is a stone stack about 35 feet high with a fire in it that does not go out. Not overnight, not on Sundays, not at Christmas. Once a furnace is in blast, it stays in blast for months, because letting it cool means the lining cracks and relining it is weeks of work and a great deal of money. So a furnace hollow is not a place people go home from. It is a place people live in company houses strung along a creek, because the stack needs feeding day and night, and the men who feed it have to be within walking distance of it at 3 in the morning. 71 men, and about 40 women and other family besides, and 1 rode in. The cook to all of it was Docia Rall, and she was 35 years old and 3 years widowed. And she had come into that hollow as something else entirely. She was a midwife. That is the thing to hold on to. She had not trained as a cook and had never wanted to be one. She had come to Bellcross in 1883 because a hollow with 40 families in it needs somebody who can attend a birth, and she had taken the cook's place 2 years later when it fell vacant and the company asked. Because the 2 jobs together made a living where one did not. She never stopped being both. And a midwife thinks about time and supply in a way that a cook, frankly, does not have to. I want to be exact about that difference, because everything hangs on it. A cook's horizon is a week. It has to be. You order against the store restocks. And the whole rhythm of the job is a loop that closes every 7 days, and has closed every 7 days for as long as anybody can remember. A cook who worried about February and June would be a bad cook, because she would be tying up money and space against something that does not happen. A midwife's horizon is the other kind entirely. A birth does not schedule itself around the road. It happens when it happens, and if it happens badly, it happens over days, and the thing a midwife learns early and never unlearns is that the trouble is almost never the event. The trouble is the aftermath, and the aftermath is long, and it arrives when everybody else has already stopped paying attention. Docia Rall had been at 31 births in that hollow by 1888. She had lost 2, which for the time and the place is a good record, and which she did not think of as a good record. And twice in her life she had been shut in somewhere by weather with somebody who needed feeding for a fortnight. The first was in Tennessee when she was 22, before she ever came west. The second was 4 miles from where she now stood, in the February of 1885. At a cabin up a side hollow, where a woman had a hard birth on the Tuesday, and a road went under water on the Wednesday, and did not come back for 9 days. They were fine. That is the thing. Everybody came through both of those, but she had spent 9 days in 1885 doing arithmetic in her head on somebody else's flour barrel, and when she came back down to Bellcross, she started putting a portion a day behind a door, and she did not tell anybody why, and there is a reason for that which I will come to, and which is not pride. Now here is what she did, every single day, for 3 years. From every meal she served, she held 1 portion back. Not scraps, not leavings. A portion a proper one, the same as any man got lifted off before the pans went out and put into a plain deal cupboard at the end of the mess house, and the cupboard was locked, and the key was on a bootlace around her neck, and it did not come off, not to sleep and not to wash. Every day. For 3 years, in front of everybody. You can imagine how that looked, because nobody could see inside it. That is the entire trouble. A locked door in a place where 71 men eat out of the same pans is a provocation all by itself, and there is no explanation you can give that will beat what a man's own imagination does with a locked door. The camp's theory, and it was a perfectly reasonable theory, was that she was selling it. There were farms down the valley and a settlement at the mill 3 miles off, and a woman quietly moving 1 portion a day out of a company kitchen for 3 years would have a nice little business running, and nobody would ever be able to prove a thing. Ovid Bracken made it arithmetic on a Thursday evening in the November of 1887. He was the storekeeper and clerk, thin and precise and not a cruel man, and he did what men like that do, which is to work it out on paper and then read the paper out. He stood in the company store with about 30 men in it and said that at 1 portion a day at the company's own costing, she had removed $61 a year, and that over 3 years that was $183 of the company's food, and that he was not accusing anybody of anything. He was simply stating what the ledger would show if anybody troubled to look. Not accusing anybody of anything. That is always the sentence. Docia Rall was not in the store. She heard about it the following afternoon from a woman being kind. And what she did next is the reason I wanted to tell you this, because it is not what anybody expects, and it is not what I would have done. She went and found Ovid Bracken in front of the same men in the same store, and she corrected his figure. Upwards, she told him he had costed it on the summer bill of fare and had undercounted the winter months, when the meat portion is larger, and that the real figure was nearer $88 a year, and that over 3 years and 2 months it came to about $282. Then she said, "If you are going to hang me for the right amount." If you've made it this far into Docia Rall's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Nobody knew what to do with that. Ovid Bracken certainly did not. A woman who corrects your accusation upward has taken something away from you, and you cannot immediately work out what. But she did not explain, and that is the part that cost her. And I have thought about why. Because it would have taken her 1 sentence. She could have stood in that store and said, "It is a reserve against the road closing. Here is the key. Come and look." 2 things stopped her, and neither of them is pride. The first is that a reserve everybody knows about is not a reserve. It is a larder. The moment 71 men know there are 41 jars of good food behind that door, the cupboard has a fortnight of life left in it at the outside, because there is always a reason. A man is sick. A man is going out on the road in bad weather. It is somebody's wedding. Every one of those reasons is good, and every one of them is true, and 20 of them in a row empties the cupboard, and the 21st reason is the one it was for. She had watched exactly that happen to a church relief store in Tennessee. The second reason is worse, and it is the one that makes this a Bellcross story rather than a general lesson. If she explained, she would have to say out loud to the company that employed her that she believed the road could shut for 3 weeks. And Bellcross had been in blast for 40 years on the assumption that it could not. You cannot tell a furnace company that the thing it has built its entire operation on top of is wrong. Not as the cook, not as a woman. They would not have been angry. That is the thing. They would have been kind, and they would have explained the road to her, and then everyone would have known that the cook had a strange idea about the weather, and the cupboard would have become a joke instead of a suspicion. She judged, correctly as it turned out, that being thought a thief left her more room to work than being thought a fool. She said one more thing that evening, and it was not an explanation, it was a statement, and it was this: that the cupboard was hers, that it would stay locked, and that she would answer for it when there was something to answer for. Then she went back to the mess house. Now I want to tell you about the mill, because the second half of this story lives down there. 3 miles down the hollow, where the creek widened, there was a water-powered grist mill, and it was run by a man named Ansel Poyer. He was 42. He was broad and slow-moving, and he had flour-worked so far into the seams of his coat that it never really came out. He had run that mill 14 years. And he had not come up to the furnace camp since 1886 because of a dispute about toll. The details do not matter much, and they were not complicated. The company had accused him of taking a heavier toll on company grain than his posted rate. He had not. He proved it in the end with his own weights and a witness, and the company accepted it in the sense that the matter was dropped and nobody ever said the word sorry. And Ansel Poyer, having been called a thief in front of people and then not uncalled it, stopped going up the hollow. He ground their grain. He sent it back. He did not come. So by the January of 1888, there were 2 people in that hollow who had been publicly accused of stealing food and quietly left to carry it, and neither of them had spoken more than 10 words to the other in 2 years. And one of them did not know the other existed as anything more than a name on a mill account. The ice came on the night of the 14th of January. I need you to understand that an ice storm is not snow. Snow is an inconvenience. An ice storm is a different order of event entirely. Rain falls when the air near the ground is below freezing, so every drop freezes on contact with whatever it touches. And it keeps falling, and the ice keeps building. 1/4 of an inch is pretty. 3/4 of an inch is dangerous. Over an inch and the trees begin to come apart. That night the hollow took somewhere near 1.5 inches. The sound is the thing everybody who lived through one remembers. All night, in the dark, the timber cracking like gunshots up and down both sides of the hollow as limbs the thickness of a man's body loaded past what they could hold and tore off. By morning the road out was under fallen timber for most of 3 miles, and every one of those trees was sheathed in ice and weighed 3 times what it should, and the whole hollow was glazed so hard that a man could not stand up on open ground without irons on his boots. The road was shut for 22 days. And here is the arithmetic that nobody at Bellcross had ever done. A furnace camp does not keep much food. It does not need to. The road is 3 miles of easy grade to the mill, and the store restocks every week, and in 40 years nothing had ever interrupted that for more than 2 days. The company store, when Ovid Bracken counted it on the morning of the 15th, held about 9 days of food for 71 men. 9 days, for a road that was going to be shut for 22. I will not pretend that first week was dramatic. It was not. It was worse than that. It was slow. Men went out with axes and worked the road and came back having made 400 yards, and the next night more limbs came down behind them. The stack had to be fed regardless, because letting a furnace go cold in the middle of all that would have finished the company. So the work went on, in ice on short rations, and the rations got shorter. By the 9th day the store was out of everything but cornmeal and about 40 pounds of salt pork. And the furnace was the reason it went that fast, which is the cruel joke underneath the whole event. A man cutting fallen timber in an ice storm burns through food at a rate that would frighten you. A man tending a stack that must not go cold burns nearly as much. Bellcross could not sit still and ration quietly the way a snowed-in farm can, because the 2 things it had to do, keep the stack fed and open the road, were the 2 hungriest jobs available. The store's 9 days of food, worked at that rate, was really about 6. Meredith Fossey cut the ration on the 4th day and cut it again on the 7th, and by the 8th there were men doing axe work on a bowl of meal and a piece of pork the size of a thumb, which is not sustainable and which everybody knew was not sustainable. That is the situation on the morning of the 9th. Not a dramatic one, a slow, cold, entirely legible one, in which a careful man with a store book could see the exact date on which there would be nothing, and the date was 6 days away, and the road was going to take a fortnight more. And that is the morning Meredith Foss came to the mess house and stood in front of the locked cupboard and asked Docia Rall to open it. He was the founder, 56 years old, gruff and fair. And he did not threaten her, and he did not shout. He said that there were 71 men in that hollow, and that if there was food behind that door he needed to know it, and that if she would not open it, he was going to have it opened, and that he would rather she did it. And Docia Rall took the bootlace off over her head and gave him the key. She did not argue. She did not make a speech. She had said 2 months earlier that she would answer for it when there was something to answer for, and this was the thing, and she handed over the key. He opened it. And I want you to see what was in there, because it was not what anybody in that room expected, and it was not what you are expecting either. It was not 3 years of food. Obviously, you cannot keep 3 years of cooked portions in a cupboard. There were 41 sealed stone jars. Every one of them held a made dish, put down under fat or in brine or dried hard, packed by a woman who knew exactly what would keep and for how long, potted meat under a finger of tallow, dried peas and barley, hard biscuit, dried apple, a great deal of rendered fat, and 9 jars of a thick meat and root pottage that would keep 4 months in cold weather and that could be let down with water to 4 times its volume. And chalked on the inside of the door, in her own hand, was a column of figures. Ovid Bracken looked at it and said, out loud, that she had been keeping accounts. She had not. That is the whole hinge of it, and nobody in that mess house understood it until she explained. It was not an inventory. It was a calendar. Each figure was a date, and beside it the number of days that jar would still be good for. She had been rotating that cupboard for 3 years, taking out whatever was approaching its limit and cooking it back into the ordinary bill of fare, and putting fresh down in its place, which meant, as she pointed out in a completely flat voice while 20 men stood there, that the camp had already eaten most of what she was accused of stealing. It had gone back into the pans, a little at a time, for 3 years, and nobody had ever noticed, because nobody notices food that arrives. What was in the cupboard on the 9th day of an ice storm was not $282 of missing company property. It was 14 days of a hard, thin, entirely adequate diet for 71 people. Meredith Foss stood there with the key in his hand for a while. Then he asked her the only question that mattered, which was, why? Why would anybody do that? Why would a cook for 3 years, at her own cost and her own reputation, put 1 portion a day behind a locked door for a road that had never once closed? And Docia Rall said, I am not a cook. She said she was a midwife, and that she had twice been at a birth in a hollow with the road shut, once in Tennessee when she was 22, and that a road closing is not the emergency. The emergency is the 3 weeks after the road closes. She said that everybody in that hollow, including him, thought about the storm. Nobody thought about the fortnight of thin, cold quiet afterwards when the excitement is over and the store is empty and the road is still shut and nothing is happening at all. She had been thinking about that fortnight since 1885. The cost of it, she said, had been about $88 a year of her own wage replacing what spoiled, which is why the figure Ovid Bracken had read out in the store was hers, not the company's. She had been paying for the privilege of being called a thief. Now the mill. On the 11th day, a man came up the hollow. He had come 3 miles over and under fallen timber with climbing irons strapped to his boots and a hand sled behind him, and it had taken him most of 2 days to do it, and on the sled were 4 sacks of meal and a side of bacon and 2 gallons of sorghum. It was Ansel Poyer, who had not been up that hollow in 2 years. He did not make a speech either. He unloaded the sled at the mess house door, and when Meredith Fossey started to say something about paying for it, he said, "It is not sold." Then he turned round and went back down for more. He did that 6 times in 11 days. 3 miles each way, on ice, dragging a sled, and the mill had grain because a mill always has grain, and he brought up something over 900 pounds of meal in total. Which, with what was in that cupboard, is the reason this is a story about 22 difficult days and not a story about something much worse. I should tell you what he was walking back into, because it matters. In 1886, the company had accused Ansel Poyer of taking a heavier toll on company grain than his posted rate. A toll is the miller's cut, taken in kind, and the rate was painted on a board on the mill wall where anybody could read it. The accusation came from a discrepancy in the company's own weighing, and it was made in the store, in front of people, in the way these things always are. He proved it wrong inside a fortnight. He had kept his own weigh book for 11 years. He had a witness who had watched the grain go in and come out, and when the company reweighed on its own scale, it found the fault was in the scale. And then nothing happened. The matter was dropped. Nobody said the word sorry, and nobody stood in the store and read out a correction. And the men who had heard the accusation mostly did not hear that there had been one. So for 2 years there were people up that hollow who half remembered that there had been something about the miller and the toll. That is the thing about a public accusation that is privately withdrawn. It does not go anywhere. It just gets quieter. And in January 1888, the man carrying it strapped irons to his boots and went up that hollow 6 times in 11 days for people who had never taken it back. Dr. Hale Ruddock reached the hollow on the 16th day, on foot with irons, and found 71 men on short commons and nobody in real trouble. And he said afterwards, in writing, that he had expected considerably worse and that the difference was a cupboard. He also refused to call it proof of anything. He said he was one man arriving late, with no way of knowing what would have happened otherwise, and that he would not sign his name to a counterfactual, which is the correct thing for a careful man to say, and it did not matter at all, because by then every person in that hollow had worked it out for themselves. The first running water under the ice was heard on the 5th of February, and the road was open on the 8th. The company made it right in the awkward way companies do. The $282 was formally struck off a ledger it had never actually been on, which is a piece of accounting theater that fooled nobody and which everybody appreciated. Ovid Bracken, to his great credit, wrote out the correction himself, and read it in the store where he had read the accusation, and he used her figure of $88 rather than his own of $61, which is a small thing and is also the whole of an apology. And Ansel Poyer kept coming up the hollow after the ice went, not with a sled, with grain, and then with nothing in particular. By the middle of February he was saying about 4 sentences a visit, which for him was a great deal, and on the 21st standing at the mess house door with his cap in his hand. He said the one that people repeated afterwards. He said, "They called me that too." 4 words, and that was the entire courtship as far as anybody at Bellcross ever saw it. 2 people who had both been publicly called thieves for doing exactly what they should have been doing, and who had each spent 2 years carrying it without complaint, and who did not need the thing explained to them. They were married at the mill on the 19th of March, which was the day the creek came up enough to turn the wheel again after the freeze. The proposal, according to the only account of it that survives, was 2 words long and was made at the mill door, and she did not tell anybody which 2 words they were. She went on as camp cook another 9 years and as midwife until she was 61. And the cupboard stayed. That is the part I like best. It stayed exactly where it was, at the end of the mess house, and it stayed locked, and she went on putting 1 portion a day into it for the rest of her working life. Nobody at Bellcross ever again asked her what was in it. There is a note in a company record from 1893 that lists the mess house fittings for an insurance valuation. And among the tables and the benches and the 2 stoves there is 1 line that somebody has written slightly larger than the rest. It says, "Cupboard, oak, locked, not to be inventoried."